Welcome back from the coffee break. In Sweden we call it fika. It's very important in Sweden with fika. Welcome, Camilla Foote. She's also a writer in the book, and now we have the opportunity to listen to you.
Thank you. Well, hello. I am Camilla Foote. That's my name sign, Camilla. I work as an advisor at Signo Foundation in Norway, Signo Konrad Svendsen Center in Oslo. And thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to talk about languaging with a person with congenital deafblindness. Some might think, how is that even possible without language? I'm going to address the issue of access to linguistic culture. My thought relates to my own experiences and also to my research. My research is a single case research, and I did it delivered this autumn in Groningen. Okay. The group of congenital deafblindness is a very heterogenic one. We know that. And we know also that the auditory and visual senses have significant importance when it comes to accessing language. I mean, that's why we're here, isn't it? It's useful to keep in mind who I'm talking about. Fellinger and his colleagues described in 2009 4 different groups. And I will focus on subgroup 1, individuals with profound blindness and residual hearing, moderate hearing. So there's some hearing. I believe exposure of cultural language structures can be provided to the individual through languaging. And as the title of this whole day indicates, the bodily-tactile modality plays a significant role. Another significant role is the one of the partner, because the languaging I'm referring to is partner-led. I feel like when I'm breathing, the breath goes into the microphone. But I must breathe in 30 minutes, so okay. Yes. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about four different concepts. Those are translanguaging and idialect, code blending, and chaining. They are all interrelated. I will try to show how. In my opinion, they all relate to a languaging practice, and I think they relate well in the context of CDB. In the end of this lecture, I hope you agree. Chaining, I just want to make a comment, because now I'm lecturing for you. I am talking, and I'm using my fingers like this when I'm talking about those 4 concepts. I'm using the PowerPoint. And all those are linking of different linguistic resources, in my view. They are acts of chaining. They are the linking of different linguistic resources meant to scaffold and maximize comprehension. So I hope my way of chaining to you will create coherence and connect to your plan as a listener. And maybe you will have another plan. And it will create new thoughts also. But I hope that it will connect to the plan I have also. So that's my intention anyway. Well, Languaging is about how we interact to make meaning. Anna started the day talk about languaging too, and languaging is not an act of doing language in the sense of using pre-existing language skills. We do not need to know cultural language beforehand. Babies, they language before they can speak. Professor Nigel Love says, there must be languaging before there can be languages.
You really should.
He also says that languaging does not depend on culturally acquired patterns. So what does it require? I think it requires competence, like having a high degree of activity, having frequently socially oriented behavior, the mastery of established turn-taking patterns, like the talking hands, listening hands, thinking position, the ability to partake in sustainable dynamic interaction over time, where you can have variation and novelties. There will be a creation of tension and movement, and it's sustainable. The interaction can bear it. Both persons languaging are able to stand with the other, both by following the other, challenging the other. They are in it together. And these competences goes for both the seeing, hearing partner and the congenitally deafblind. The theory of translanguaging describes the use of different linguistic resources in the meaning-making process. Different linguistic resources can be different languages, like spoken language, sign language, but it can also be other means, like pointing to an object. I believe it applies well on languaging in the context of CDB. We often deploy different means, different ways of communicating. The linguistic sources are somewhat atypical, but I think it's arguable to call them linguistic. And several of you have mentioned that before. Sometimes there are conventional signs and words, like the categories Göran talked about, but not necessarily conventional meanings. There can also be extensive use of different negotiated signs. Bodily-Tactile expressions, bets, HTP signs, all of these expressions that the deafblind have. We can call all of that bodily-tactile expressions, just for the ease of it, okay? So, translanguaging is a theory that it offers a language theory that regards language different from what we're used to. It regards language as seen from the internal perspective of a person. Now, that's quite different from how we usually conceptualize language. Pierre Linnell says, and I think it goes for most of us, we are accustomed to thinking of language or the linguistic resources for sense-making. We are accustomed to thinking of language as the language system. When we say language, we think of the language system, right? He refers to cultural language, language of the broader community. But this is language as seen from the outside of the speaker. In translanguaging, it's different. Translanguaging is clarified to be the deployment of a person's linguistic repertoire, without regard of the boundaries of cultural language. I don't have to mind if I'm using a right or wrong language, or it's when a grammarian study the way people use language, they really study, well, when they study how the people deploy their linguistic resources, how they use language, they really study the person's idialect. The idialect. Idialect is the person's unique personal language. I have my idialect, and you have your idialect. Let us think about the expressions of a congenitally deafblind. This is this person's unique language, the idialect of the deafblind person. And the partner has his or hers idialect too. My idialect is dominated by Norwegian, as spoken in the southeastern part of Norway. I speak English. I speak Norwegian Sign Language. I speak some French, even some German, a few Spanish and Italian, a few words just from vacation on the Mediterranean. But all of this is within my idialect, my linguistic repertoire, right? We can see that the two idialects have just a few overlapping areas. If I was to compare the idialect of me and Göran, there would be much more overlap, I think. I'm pretty sure. And when we have a lot of overlap, it means it's easier to communicate. There are just a few overlapping areas, but there are some areas. And the point of departure in languaging is when the partner recognizes and responds to the expressions coming from the person with CDB. Now let's turn to co-blending. The research I just did at the University of Groningen. Whoops. I even had a Dutch word in my dialect. Groningen. The research uses data, video recordings of my interaction with a child with congenital deafblindness and residual hearing. I am leading the languaging on the tape, and as we will focus on cultural language and access to cultural language, the language competence of the partner is relevant. I'll therefore say a few words about my linguistic background. I grew up in a hearing family. I learned Norwegian spoken language, because that's what everybody spoke. It's very mainstream. My encounter with Norwegian Sign Language started 27 years ago. By coincidence, I got a summer job in an institution that provides housing for deaf and deafblind people with additional needs. And 6 years later, I qualified to be a professional sign language interpreter, both for the deaf and acquired deafblind. Professionally, I worked using visual and tactile sign language and spoken language. And 8 years ago, I got introduced to the field of congenital deafblindness. 2 years ago, I was fortunate to work in the school for the deafblind, and I found it very useful then to have both spoken language and sign language / tactile sign language competence in the role of the teacher. So in my dialect, I also have the tactile sign language and experience and talking to former sighted sign language people who became blind and used tactile sign language. Okay, So, in my dialect, I have 2 cultural languages, at least. I'm English and other also, but for the research and on the tape, the interesting is Norwegian spoken language and Norwegian sign language. And on the, what is it, the right column, it says oral auditory modality. Oral for speaking and auditory for receiving. Gestural for expressing. Visual for receiving. That's how it goes. So bodily-tactile modality would be bodily for expressing and tactile for receiving. Okay. So linguistic culture. We often talk of 2 corresponding modalities that characterize language mediation. And when we often think of cultural language, we tend to think only one modality at a time, if you follow me. But linguistic culture can have different modalities. Sign language, as I mentioned, is a linguistic culture. Expresses through a gestural visual modality. Gesture for expressing. But to be more precise, gesturing for expressing in sign language means using hands, upper body, and face. And when signers go blind, sign language can be used and mediated tactilely. But then facial expressions are no longer as available. And for example, if you want to say, if in sign language you can express questions with a question face. You know, you raise your eyebrows and you have this question kind of look in your face. And it's really awkward. You don't use that in tactile sign language, that you touch the other's face to understand if it's a question. Instead, you express question differently. You say what with your fingers. Perhaps you had talking hands posing the question, ending with a what, and going up in listening position, because you expect an answer. So it's a different way of posing a question, but it can be modified. It's just an example. There are different ways, different modalities to mediate language. I think access to cultural language is about accessing cultural language that are already there. A yellow line is just a theoretical construct. It's not a cultural language. And I think we don't have to think this way, that it has to be the bodily-tactile modality only. Perhaps cultural language can be accessed through other modalities than only the 2 corresponding ones. And maybe linguistic culture can be accessed through more than one modality for expression and more than one modality for perception. That's what I thought before I started my research. I was curious about, but do we have to limit ourselves to only one set of modalities? If this is the case, it's good news, because Jacques Souriau, he says that the communication of people with CDB and residual hearing is often characterized by using more than one system for communicating. Often perceiving through the hearing, hearing for receiving, and signing for expression. So that's a mix, isn't it, of different languages. If you're hearing for receiving and signing for expressing, how is that possible? But if you can use more than one modality for receiving and more than one modality for expressing, perhaps it's doable. If you use more than 2 languages, like most of us do, English, Norwegian, like I am now, you're considered a bilingual or multilingual. Bilinguals use 2 or more languages naturally. Fluency in spoken language and sign language. That's a specific kind of bilingual language use. It's called bimodal bilingualism. I'm a bimodal bilingual. I didn't know until I read theory. And important information is that the 2 languages, Norwegian Sign Language, Norwegian Spoken Language, they have so different language structures. Just keep that in mind. Studies on bimodal bilingualism, use of sign and speech, is concerned with how the languages interact. A unique feature is the possibility of using the 2 languages at the same time. With 2 spoken languages, it's not possible. But with 2 bimodal languages, it is. Sign language and spoken language are articulated using different channels and have separate systems for both perception and production. This kind of mixing languages is called code blending. Remember? Code blending. Baker and van den Bogaarde describe 4 different kinds that base on the semantics of the utterance. The 4 different types, you can see them here. The upper line, the gray line, is grandma is talking with you. It's a spoken, grandma is talking with you. And the signing is grandma signing. This is a spoken base blend because it's a blend that's based on the spoken language. Signs has but an accompanying function. In the example here, in the signing, lacks information about who grandma is signing with. It doesn't say. This is like sign-supported speech. Many of you are familiar with that. So in sign language, we don't have prepositions with you. In sign language, we would say, you'll place you, and you'll place grandma, and you two are signing. It's different structure. The blue line is a sequential mix. It starts out with spoken part, and then it says like, how does that ATV? It starts with spoken and ends with signing. But the 2 most interesting blends are the white line, it's a sign language base blend, and the green line, the full blend. I'll try to explain why. At home, you ride the ATV together with Grandpa. Home, you ride the ATV together with Grandpa. It's a sign language-based blend. I categorized it as sign language-based blend because I think it sounds a bit weird. We wouldn't say that in spoken language, but still, I can understand. It makes sense in spoken too. But I would perhaps put the words a little different. But if it makes sense, it's semantically congruent, and it works fine. The green line is full of blend. So in that kind of blending, none of the languages are suppressed. Yeah. So, Grandpa, nice. Grandpa is nice. That's how we say it in spoken language and in sign language. Grandpa is nice. Okay. Just briefly look at what we learned about how to stimulate people with CDB to develop communication and language. Of course, everything that's been said earlier today apply, and recognizing and affirming the child's own contributions, that's where the languaging starts. Conventional language can be mapped on using signs and words. And from the internet website, library, TSB, yeah, I'll just show you. I just took some screenshots of what they say. When the interaction partner affirms the child's expressions of these tactile memory traces and adds words or signs, he or she nourishes the development of language. So, but no one specifies how exactly it may happen. One goal is to make cultural language accessible, so they can grasp it, really. And embedded in this, it is not a core task to stimulate the CDB person's expressive language growth. How can we do that? If you have hearing for receiving and signing for expressing, it matters what kind of language exposure I, as a partner, can provide. And all other partners of the person. From numerous studies of mainstream language development, they have found, I'm reading, strong correlations between the frequency of particular structures in the ambient language and their order of emergence in the child's speech. It means, in terms of structure, what goes in, comes out. They talk about structures, not simply words or signs. Structures are grammatical features, word order, how to place events in time, how to indicate who is doing what and where. It's unlikely that in the child's expressive language, there will suddenly appear structures that doesn't correlate with the structure that partners use. The structure in what the person hears must align with the structure that may appear in the signing later on, further down the road. And as the sign language and spoken language has very different structure, spoken language structure does not align with sign language structure. This is where code blending opens up new possibilities, and where translanguaging theory says it's quite all right to mix languages and modalities all you want. But the structure we want in the child's expressive language is the structure we need to expose to the child. The two code blendings applicable to sign language structure are therefore extremely interesting. In my case study, the 10-year-old child had not developed expressive spoken language. Signing is believed to be her primary means of expression. The language structure that may apply in the signed expressive language are not the ones found in spoken language. Language structure applicable in signed communication may, for example, be the use of SVO syntax. You think what? The use of handshapes. We talked about that earlier today. Like in Norwegian Sign Language, a flat B hand looks like this. It can be a car. Driving forward, driving backward, driving up a mountain, parking a car. It can be a bus. It can be a stroller. Taxi. It can be the subway. It can be the roller coaster. Oh, that's very funny. Roller coaster going up. And we can just show how it goes. We can have another classifier like index finger for being a person. It can be a person standing, coming towards me, going away. It can be two persons passing by. We can talk to them. We can, hello, bye. They are out of reach, but still they're in this interaction because they are represented by classifier. We can have same hand shape like standing or sitting, lying on the back or lying on the belly, falling down, falling like this, sitting on a swing. These are language structures that apply in assigned communication. Also, the use of timelines in sign language is very efficient. We don't have verb inflection in sign language. So in a sign communication, it doesn't make sense to try and have verb inflection. But instead, you can use timelines. You can say, today, we do what? Or, yesterday, we do what? Or tomorrow, we do what? And when you talk about something that's been or something that's coming, you can add other concepts like memory. Yesterday, remember? You and I did what? Or we can look forward to. We can be excited because tomorrow we do what? I just added the picture of a book. It's really quite new, and it's the encyclopedia of the sign languages of the world. And in the front, there is a small introduction of some common features of sign languages. And I think it will differ. In my case, it was Norwegian spoken language and Norwegian sign language. But how these languages relate may differ. In other countries, it can be different. I don't know. But there seems to be some fundamental properties in sign language that are quite universal. I'm going to finish with chaining. I said a little bit about chaining in the beginning. Chaining is also important in the languaging because it's a linking strategy. It's an act of scaffolding to maximize comprehension. And it's said to be important for the meaning making. And that's what we do in languaging. We make meaning. So chaining is really essential. And it helps create communicative flow. Just give you one example. Chaining can be to speak the word book. It can be to sign book, fingerspell, book. It can be to point at the printed word, to touch the braille. It can be to touch the book, the item, the book itself. So we chain when we interact by responding, by confirming, expanding. By reciprocating, when we acknowledge what the others say, when we relate to the child's or the person's utterance as being coherent with the topic. I respond as if it is coherent with the topic. Then I have trust in the other. I chain by responding, by mirroring, by repeating. And the full code blending, when you say you and me together, you use sign and spoken at the same time, is also a way of chaining. When you use sound and signs, tactile and perceivable, together. They support the perception of the other. Yeah. I don't think it really matters what the subject is. I think sometimes it can be a challenge for me as a partner to partake in languaging about a subject that I have experienced before, again and again. And I think it doesn't matter. I think it's, as long as it matters to the child, to the person, it's in the person's interest. That's what matters. We can learn a whole bunch of language structure talking about a teddy bear or going swimming, or I might find it challenging to talk about the same subject for a long time. But in terms of language development, I think it's just super. Because within a safe, well-known subject, I can add novelties, and I can paraphrase, and I can add new perspectives more easily. So I think it's a good thing. You mustn't underestimate those familiar subjects. And maybe they have other meaning potentials that I'm used to. Maybe I'm too narrow-minded. Maybe I should open up. What can it mean? We create the meaning together, right? Okay. Thank you.
I was trying to get contact with Camilla because we have decided that we have agreed about that I should give her a message. It was 10 minutes left, and I couldn't get contact. And then she looked at Yara, and then you just finished. Are there any questions? No, and I don't think so from the stream. Publicum, no? You have some minutes left then, if you want to just, if you want to.
Can I say something?
Yes, of
now
course.
I get the hat roll on as a mother. When I had my daughter Trine 30 years ago, I understood that we have to learn a language together. And I thought that language was sign language. And I learned that it's very important to separate those languages, Norwegian and sign language, or else you'll destroy the language. You will never learn a language. And I struggled with that. So I did something wrong. I mixed it. Because that was what worked with her, with low vision and very hard of hearing. And now you tell me that I was trans-languaging, and that's, you have the theory to tell me it was right. And I'm very happy. Thank you very much. It worked for her, and you tell me it's the theoretical base too. So, thank you.
Good. I think it's important to notice that it's not any blend that will work. It's important to separate the different blends, if it's spoken base blend, or if it's sign language base blend, or if it's a full blend. I think that's important because if the person depends on a signed expression, then it needs to have a sign language base blend and or a full blend. But if the child expresses through a spoken language, then signing it's nice to support her audition and support development of spoken language. So it depends really on what expressive language you expect is doable down the road. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, I'm finished.
Thank you, Camilla, for sharing this. I can take it afterwards. You don't have to.